Welcome, everyone, to Evo Book Talk. Today, we'll be talking with David Mazauer of the Yiddish Book Center. We'll be discussing his new book and the catalog to the Yiddish Book Center's, I believe it's the permanent exhibition, correct?
Correct. Yes.
Um,
Yes.
Called Yiddish, A Global Culture, Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity. Um, Great title that encompasses this moment in Yiddish culture that we're dealing with. And we'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. And if you'd like to let us know where you're coming from in the chat, um, we're curious. And I could see here Reno, Nevada, Annapolis, Maryland, Atlanta, Georgia. Um, and you can also see a link in the chat to buy Yiddish, A Global Culture from the Evo store, the Evo online store. You can also get it on Amazon uh, and good booksellers everywhere. And I assume the Yiddish Book Center as well.
Yes. Yes. Uh,
Okay, we'll be getting started in just a minute. Um, you have reached the Evo Zoom talk of Yiddish, A Global Culture by David Mazauer. Uh, we We're getting started in just a minute. If you want to let us know where you're coming from in the chat, please do so. Here's New Brunswick, New Jersey. And as I said, we'll be getting started in just a minute. St. Paul, Minnesota. Um, this is again Evo Book Talk with David Mazauer of the Yiddish Book Center. We'll be discussing his new book, Yiddish, A Global Culture, which is the catalog to the Yiddish Book Center's permanent exhibit. And we will get started in just a minute. And again, if you want to let us know where you're coming from in the chat, please do. We have Halifax, Nova Scotia, St. Paul, Minnesota. I think we have more than one of those. Um,
Eddie, you mentioned magic previously. Do you have any Houdini posters in Yiddish in the collection?
we don't have any Houdini posters in Yiddish. And it's, I would say that it's less magic of that nature than magic of like like a folkloric
Right.
nature.
Yeah.
Um, okay, I think we can get started. Um, Welcome, everyone. This is the Evo Book Talk for Yiddish, A Global Culture, Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity. This is the new book by David Mazauer, who I can introduce him right here and now. He is a research bibliographer and editorial director at the Yiddish Book Center. He's also the chief curator and writer of the center's landmark permanent exhibition, Yiddish: A Global Culture. Prior to joining the center, he was a senior staff journalist with BBC World News in London and deputy curator of the Jewish Museum, London. He writes for the Digital Yiddish Theater Project and is the author of Yiddish Theater in London. His dozens of published articles include several on his great-grandfather, Yiddish writer Sholem Asch, as well as explorations of Yiddish theater and popular culture, British Jewish history, Jewish art, and the Yiddish salon of Bronx poet Bertha Kling. He graduated with a degree in history from Cambridge University and has a postgraduate diploma in Russian. Please welcome David Mazauer. Before we start, I just want to say that if we will leave time for questions at the end. So if anyone has questions, put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom, not in the chat, because I will not be reading the chat section during this experience. We're going to start off with a uh, short slideshow of the book Yiddish: A Global Culture, and then we'll jump into it. So, can we start the slideshow? Great. So everyone now has a little bit of a sense of what's inside this book. It's, really incredibly rich. It's full of stunning images of books, rare artifacts, art. It's a big book. I think it's about 350 pages. It's large format. It's a coffee table book. It's hefty. You bend your knees when you lift the book. It's really fantastic. It's I want to congratulate you. It's really, monumental. It's amazing. Um,
Thanks, Eddie. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. It's a pleasure to be here with Yivo. You will have recognized many of the photographs in the book
right.
as coming from Yivo's collections. We couldn't have made this particular book and produced the exhibition in the way that we did without the Yivo archives and the extraordinary materials you have there. So we're thoroughly indebted to you. And of course, Yivo has also got its own gorgeous, magnificent coffee table book. So we now have two coffee table books about Yiddish, which, let there be many more. Bring it on. Um, so what a wonderful thing that is. I love the Yivo book. Very, very different, obviously. So yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, especially hosted by Yivo.
Well, thanks. Yes, yeah, I did, obviously I recognize a lot of the material in the book. But there's also a lot of material that I hadn't seen. Um and that's I guess one of the joys of working on a project like this that's so broad uh that you get to sort of pick and choose and dive into areas that you may not have gotten to previously. So I'm just just since I curate myself, I'm curious to know what how did this what was the how did the structure of this you know come together?
Yeah, and you curate magnificent, beautiful exhibitions. I've
Thank
drawn
you.
on several of them for the exhibition and for the book. I should also, by the way, say that David Roskis has contributed a wonderful essay to the
Yes.
book. So I want to acknowledge David
Yes,
and his
absolutely. You know what?
role.
I will, even though he was my dissertation advisor, I will have to say that his essay is, and I don't use this lightly. It's magisterial. It's fantastic.
Yeah, so the book and the exhibition has drawn on the work of you and scholars and translators and so many people in the field. In a way, it takes stock of this particular moment that we've reached. In 30 years, 50 years' time, people will look back on us and say, they didn't have books about this, they didn't know this, they hadn't understood that. So we're all discovering Yiddish generation by generation. But it feels like a very exciting time to be working in this field. There are so many new approaches. And I guess squarely in the book and in the exhibition, the work on gender and, discovering, rediscovering, translating women writers, women artists, women activists, was really front and center of the project. Um, and so, yeah, curating and writing and assembling the exhibition and the book, I really wanted to draw on some new material, to try and surface new material. And that was especially hard here because, those of you who know the Yiddish Book Center know we're rich in used books and we have an extraordinary digital archive of Yiddish literature. But the history of the book center is not one where we've solicited archives and material culture so much. It's really primarily a repository of books and now a broad-ranging cultural center. So, but to produce an exhibition of this sort, there had to be objects, and so where were those going to come from? And it was often serendipitous. I'll maybe touch on two quick examples. So, Sholem Asch is my great grandfather. I've always been, curious, not as an expert. I wouldn't call myself that, but just about his career and his life. And when I took up the job at the book center in 2017, I had a sort of checklist of people I wanted to meet and people to reach out to. And one of them was Peretz Hirschbein Jr., so the grandson of Peretz Hirschbein, the writer. and I reached out to Peretz Hirschbein to just find out more about the relationship between Peretz Hirschbein, the writer, and my great grandfather, who were exact contemporaries and celebrities and playwrights and story writers and world travelers and so on. Anyway, that led me very quickly to Peretz's mother, Jessica Hirschbein, the daughter-in-law of the literary couple, Peretz Hirschbein and Esther Shumiacher. And Jessica turned out to be the biggest single donor to the exhibition project, not least because she had their steamer trunk that they traveled the world with in the 1920s sitting in her basement on the Upper West Side in New York, with no idea really of, what to do with this. So that became the core of an exhibit about the traveling lives of the Hirschbeins and their really extraordinary adventures. And, they were 6 months on an ashram and 7 months in Soviet Crimea and had extraordinary museum quality scrolls, Chinese calligraphic scrolls and Tibetan artifacts. And it's just a unique story. So that became one exhibit that features in the book. Another example, I was, you and I probably both spend too much time on Facebook. I was scrolling and came across a post by the actor Shane Baker a few years ago. He was in Tel Aviv doing a performance. He was at Beit Leivik, one of the Yiddish cultural centers there. And so there was a photograph of Shane and Daniel Galai, the director, but I was struck by what was in the background, which, as I zoomed in on it, was a micrograph, one of these portraits made up of thousands of Hebrew letters. And of course, it was a portrait of Leivik, the writer after whom the center is named. It was color. It was just magnificent. It had a sort of Siberian cell, reflecting his early years in Siberian exile. I was instantly curious and found out that it was by an Argentinian amateur artist called Gedalia Tannenbaum, and made my way eventually to his daughter, Tannenbaum's daughter. Tannenbaum was an activist in leftist circles in Buenos Aires, a political refugee from Poland. And she ended up donating. You saw at some point in that slideshow this sort of very, trippy close-up of the spectacles and then the pullback of the portrait of Chaim Zhitlovsky, the intellectual and activist and Yiddishist. So, she donated that from her collection of his surviving work, that portrait of Chaim Zhitlovsky, which is a one-off original hand-inked thing he spent months, laboring at in the evenings after coming home from his textile factory where he worked. So that really became a big part of the years assembling the exhibition was really trying to find those things.
That's great. And the global nature of it, I love. It's so perfect. I mean, you can, if you work in Yiddish culture, you can focus on one particular city and spend a lifetime doing it. But the reality of Yiddish culture that it's a worldwide culture and it goes everywhere. And so it's fantastic that you're able to sort of elucidate that in the book in so many different ways. Um, I mean, I do want to talk about that more, but before we get to that, I wanted to ask, you wrote this really fantastic introduction, uh, and you yourself have an interesting story and this has to do with Sholem Asch, of how you fell into the Yiddish world. And when I read your bio, you worked for the BBC. This is clearly something you didn't have to do. It seems like you had a career. Um, so I'm curious to know how that, like if you could sort of encapsulate that a bit and talk about how you fell into this somewhat unusual cultural world.
Yeah, yeah. I think that has to do partly with the fact that I was born and grew up in London, within a sort of British Jewish milieu, which is obviously very different from the American one, both in scale and in other respects. But leaving that aside, I'll just say that on both sides of my family, I have, you know, interesting Yiddish connections. So the Sholem Asch is my mother's father. But on our father's side, and my brother wrote a book about this, we have, a founding member of the Bund, my paternal grandfather, Mordcha Mazover in Russian. And my brother wrote a wonderful book called What You Did Not Tell about our Bundesgrandfather and that whole Russian and Soviet side of our family. So, I should have sort of been squarely steeped in this stuff, but the reality of sort of mid-20th century Jewish identity and the way we were brought up, we were thoroughly sort of divorced from any Jewish communal structures, really. My parents didn't belong to a shul and I didn't have a bar mitzvah. And it was sort of, on the sidelines very much. I did have a very good relationship with my grandmother. For many years, she lived into her mid-90s, and I was always curious about this sort of extraordinary home she had full of Sholem Asch's artifacts and Judaica and books signed by Hemingway and, major writers of all sorts, Theodore Dreiser and all sorts of, people who were part of his intellectual world. But it was sort of distant and remote, and I couldn't kind of make sense of it. I did a history degree and then Soviet history postgrad work. Ended up sort of leaving that aside. I wasn't really interested in the academic world after a while, and I worked at the Jewish Museum for 3 years, a sort of startup museum in the 1980s, and spent most of that time getting to know the last of the Yiddish actors and doing an exhibition about Yiddish theater in London. And that was my kind of way into the whole world. And then I was hooked, and I just became more and more interested. I went into the BBC, but also worked as a Yiddishist and wrote and researched, and just I'm particularly interested, as you are, I think, in surfacing characters and writers and people who are in the Yiddish world who've just sort of fallen out of our mental map undeservedly. And the exhibition was an extraordinary opportunity to do that and surface some more of those characters. But yeah, I became increasingly interested in this idea, and you can sort of trace it to Sholem Asch and his career of the global Yiddish world as thoroughly interconnected and its own kind of cohesive civilization. So this idea that you could travel with Yiddish from, I don't know, Montreal to New York to Buenos Aires to Johannesburg to Melbourne, all around Central and Eastern Europe, and then London and Paris. You would not only be able to get by with the common language, but in each of those places, it was a recognizable milieu, the same Landsmannschaft, hometown societies, the same newspapers, the same sort of working class culture and grassroots support for this culture, without which, it would never have developed in the way that it did. And I've always thought that was just a unique facet of it, and this idea that, okay, you can sort of talk about high culture and whatever else, popular culture, but actually, if you're a Yiddish actor, you have to do both. You maybe do a Shakespeare monologue as part of your sketch show one night, and then the next night, you're doing a whole vaudeville number, and that was also true of many of the writers. So that's always fascinated me, and I guess the exhibition and the book reflect that in the way that I approach the subject.
Yeah, and I think that the book really reveals, this aspect of popular culture that you're talking about. And to a certain degree, I think that that's part of, the zeitgeist in Yiddish studies now, is that people have become more interested in, I mean, I personally, I am as well, but, significantly more people have, left the sort of, not really left, but uh, they're taking less interest in the sort of Yiddish classic, high culture, productions, and they're focusing more on popular culture, whether it's theater or literature. Shund has become, of great interest, and I think rightfully so, because I think more Yiddish readers read that than than high quality literature, which I think you would expect that in any literature. It's the Yiddish isn't special in that regard. And I think that the book does a good job in revealing that aspect and revealing those aspects of, you have a section on bestsellers, and we see the Max Spitzkoff books, which are great. And this is a series of detective stories that was just published. Um, and it's really it's fantastic. But just to quickly go back to Sholem Ash, and one of the things I found interesting was, because I do what I do, one of the first places in the book I looked was where all the images came from. And one of the things I noticed uh, was there's a fair number from collection of David Mazower, who apparently has,
Guilty as charged.
yeah, who apparently has a really fantastic collection of Yiddish related artifacts. And I don't know if they're all from the Sholem Ash collection, or this is just something that you have
Yeah, yeah.
amassed
I
over
would
the years.
no. The answer is no. Most of them, almost all of them, are not, because Ash was. I mean, Ash was a collector of Judaica and paintings, and but not Yiddish, not Yiddish cultural materials really. It just wasn't. No, he didn't. And no, I've been collecting for 40 years, and I kind of collect as a way to understand and make sense of things that I can't easily maybe find, explored in detail in other words. I mean, one example is the Groschen Bibliothek series, this really just, extraordinary story of 275 pocket encyclopedia pamphlets that appeared in Poland in Warsaw from 1930 to 37, and was a huge hit. I mean, they were published in editions of 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 each every week under the auspices of the Hind, one of the major daily papers. And again, as you said, with popular culture and the shund, the so-called trash literature, the pulp fiction. Um, of course, there's a Yiddish everyman's encyclopedia and everyman's classics, but it has a particular cast. So it has Yiddishist figures, but it also squarely addresses the rise of fascism from 1933 onwards. There's a lot about Polish non-Jews. There's a lot about Polish political events, and then there are just global celebrities like Marie Curie and all sorts of other figures. So it again, it's this fascinating um, microcosm of a world that's both Jewish and non-Jewish, and you see the sort of intellectual curiosity of the people who are reading it, and it spawned libraries, not libraries, reading circles, um, Leandika Kreisen in towns and shtetls across Poland. People would wait for the latest one to arrive in the post, and they would gather their friends and sit around and read it communally. And so communal sort of aspect, collective and communal aspect of the culture is also really at the front and center of the exhibition and the book. But yeah, I just began seeing those things pop up on eBay, for $5, $7 or something. And I thought, this is really interesting. It's very little to be read about it. I then discovered that your former colleague Lyudmila Sholokova, wonderful librarian who's now at the New York Public, was similarly kind of curious. We ended up co-writing an article about them for the Book Center's magazine, and I've just continued to collect them. And I probably have 200 of the 375, or I probably won't, ever get beyond 250. But I love reading them and seeing them and understanding what they represented in this incredibly what's the word? Voraciously, intellectual is not really necessarily the right word, but culturally curious working class culture that is at the heart of Warsaw and the Lower East Side and all the Jewish immigrant areas, and that's what that series represents to me.
Right. And obviously also, you're dealing with a culture that didn't have screen culture, barely had radio. And it's to a certain degree, especially to younger generations, it's difficult, it's often difficult to convey the nature of the importance of print culture. That's all there was. And as you say, people read voraciously. This because this is how you gained knowledge. You couldn't, flip through your phone and have the world at your feet. Um, it's totally different. So,
So true, and yeah, and in terms of just that particular series, the Penny Library, the Groschen Bibliothek series, they have such an intimate relationship with their readers. Every so often they sort of pause and say, this is what you're telling us about the Groschen Bibliothek. This is what it means to you. And they relay some comments from readers, every so often. And it's such an intimate relationship within the print culture. Obviously, one of your special subjects, Eddie, the daily press, you see that
Yeah.
so clearly. And by the way, one of the things that's just um, very kind of rewarding about doing the sort of public history work that you do and that I do and others do is that sense that you sort of reframe people's understanding of their own family history and their own past. So we have a big section on the Yiddish press, and we foreground the story of the forwards. And I had somebody look at that. I remember a few months ago, a couple were looking at it, and I got chatting to them, and the guy said, now I remember in my grandparents' apartment, they had this tottering pile of copies of the forwards that would build up. And I understand two things now, he said, which I never sort of appreciated before. One is that they were keeping them because they carried the serialized novels that they needed to, if they wanted to refer back, you had to have the
Sure.
back issues. And the other thing he said is simply that I understand what they were reading and what this newspaper meant. And I just thought it was, some sort of yellowing paper that was of no significance. And now I understand that this was their whole intellectual world, their whole sort of social and cultural world. So, and that's powerful to be able to cast a sort of different light for people on parts of their own history and family stories that they maybe hadn't thought about in that way.
Right. And the newspaper, for I mean, I think most people today don't read a paper newspaper, but in the over the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, a newspaper was just something you threw away. A newspaper, and it depends on the person, of course, but a newspaper, typically, uh, you throw it away. It could be used to wrap fish or put in the bottom of a bird cage. Um, but there are certain instances where people save things, and one of the interesting things in the book is a scrapbook of cartoons from the Morgan Freiheit that someone took the time to cut out and paste into a scrapbook. And in the collections of Evo, there are, I don't know, hundreds and hundreds of items like that people who were reading daily newspapers would cut out articles specific to issues that they were interested in, or cartoons or photographs or whatever. And that, it's an indication of how important these papers were to people's lives. And what I really like is the cover of the book. The photograph on the cover of the book is, I think, a group of workers out on a picnic. Um, here we go. Uh, and they're holding their newspaper. This is a group of, like, young workers, young laborers, and it's what is it, the Nayat site? Um,
Yes. Yeah. Hmm.
and and there again in Evo's photo archives, there are lots of photographs like that of people, not just groups but individual, posing with the newspapers they read. You know, they were dedicated to the writers, to the product that that this represented, whether it was a political ideology or the serialized novels that they loved, or whatever else appeared in the paper. This was enormously important to them, as were Yiddish books. And another item you have in the book, and I don't know if it came across in the video, but there's like a little card catalog of a reader. Can you talk about that a bit? I found that so fascinating.
Yeah, and the bigger point here is that what is culture? In its broadest sense, it's the whole web of interactions and the whole kind of community of people, which includes the readers and the folks who put a cent or a penny in a collections box in the sweatshop or in the place where they work to support Poale Zion or the Bund or whatever it was. And I really wanted to reflect that grassroots intensity and energy that supported all this work. Without groups of Yiddish speakers in all these different cities, none of this really would have built up and survived. So that was important to me to reflect. We have an individual's trousseau with a samovar and some cutlery, and in another case, and example of that was a communist who was brought up before the House Un-American Activities Committee and interrogated a radical dentist in the Bronx who cut out these cartoons from the Morgan Freiheit. And what did you just ask me, Eddie?
About the catalog of the
Yes,
library catalog.
the card cast. So this is Samuel Judin, a Brooklyn immigrant tailor. And so back in 2018, 2019, just before COVID, I work with 2 or 3 wonderful graduate fellows every year who come here for a year. Many of them go on to do PhDs in the field or in Jewish studies. And so over the course of those 2 years with the fellows, we really trawled the sort of length and breadth of the Yiddish Book Center to find whatever had been long buried in corners in the basement and locked away in cupboards. And we unearthed all sorts of things. And one day we were looking through a box that we'd pulled out of the basement, and there was this sort of beautifully made wooden box. And when we flipped it open, there were about 100 of these index cards, which turned out to be the catalog, the self-made catalog of this tailor's library. And clearly his pride and joy was his library of Yiddish books. And it included, a bit of typical, some science, some popular knowledge stuff, some literature, some poetry. And so this was a kind of beautiful thing in itself. But the really extraordinary thing then was, a couple of years later, we got a donation from a synagogue library, and there were some books that had been in Samuel Judin's library, which we knew because he inserted into every one of his books a little tag, a sort of string tag with his card and a photo of him on the bottom of it. And these books had that tag. So we were able to make this display case that includes his card catalog that had been donated sometime in the 1990s by his daughter-in-law to the book center, with this set of 6 or 7 books that had serendipitously kind of made their way to us. Somebody was watching over us. So that was just a magical moment when we realized that these books were, Samuel Judin's books. And so that was too good not to exhibit and put in the book.
No, it's perfect. It's really perfect. And just in connection with that, and this doesn't really have to do with the book, but I always imagine that at the book center, you get over the past 40 some 50 years, you've gotten all these shipments of books from various libraries, individuals, whatever. Invariably, you find things between the pages. And in a way, this card catalog is something like that. You found his marks in the shipment, but I'm just curious, if you save these things, or if what do you do with them?
We absolutely save them. We have a box called Random Ephemera from Books. I think by now we probably have 2 or 3 boxes of that sort. And certainly, since I've been here in 2017, we absolutely save anything like that. We have pressed flowers, we have little tiny passport photographs of people's babies that fell out of a book, laundry tickets. You see this stuff, I'm sure, and obviously in the collections you process and deal with. And it's always wonderful, very occasionally you can kind of work out that you might be able to find somebody to whom this will be meaningful, and we or somebody makes a donation, leaves a set of books at the desk at the front, and they go away. We look through them, and then we find some family photograph, and maybe they don't realize they've left it. So we'll contact them and say, did you mean to leave this, this family photograph? Do you want it? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But more often than not, it's just long ago and anonymous. And so actually in the exhibition, I don't think I put it in the book, but it's in a case in the exhibition. There's a 500 ruble note
Oh,
that's about the size of the screen I'm looking at here on my little laptop. And fluttered out of a book one day. It was clearly being used as a bookmark. So we looked up the history of, what's it worth? Kind of nothing. And
right,
immediately post 1917, almost nothing. It was no longer
right.
legal currency. But, somebody had kept it and no doubt, was using it as a bookmark. And it's the one and only time we've seen a 500 ruble note, you know, just make its way to us in those circumstances. But it was sort of magical. It just sort of slowly fluttered to the floor, and we picked it up and then realized what it was. But
That's
yeah,
great.
we keep all these things. We have,
Yeah.
we have it in boxes
It's
and keep it.
potentially a good small exhibit for the for the book center. If
Yeah,
you
and then then there's stuff that's really of historic importance, like we were talking about the writer Leivik and the micrograph by the Polish Argentinian weaver artist, and so at some point many years ago, Leivik's son Joel Leivik donated books from his father's library to the book center. And of course, many of them are inscribed and dedicated to Leivik by writers he knew. And the one of them is from Marc Chagall, and it's one of Bella Chagall's books. So it's one of Bella Chagall's two Yiddish books, but it was the one that was published just after she died, tragically and suddenly. And I think it was 1943, after soon after coming to America, escaping from France. They escaped from southern France, and she got ill and died very suddenly, and it was a tremendous shock to everybody who knew them. And so Chagall sends her book that she never got to see and hold, because she'd written it, but it hadn't yet appeared. And he sends a copy to Leivik, and he includes a photograph, the last photograph taken of Bella, and he inscribes it. And so that is, that then became a
sure.
case in the exhibition, and we display it, and in the case, we display this picture alongside it, which is Paris in the 1920s and Chagall painting Bella's portrait.
Right, that's
So
perfect.
so yeah, so that's a different category of artifact of that sort. But yeah, material culture is everywhere through the book and the exhibit.
Right. Yeah, that Chagall image is fantastic. But as far as other artifacts go, one of the artifacts that piqued my interest in the book that gets a big sort of full spread is the Jacob Gordon cigarette wrapper.
An eBay find, Eddie.
Tell me more.
So um, yeah, I'm one of the there's it's impossible not to be fascinated by Yiddish funerals because they're just overwhelmingly huge and set piece public events. So whether it's Avram Goldfarb, the Yiddish theater guy, whether it's Shalom Aleichem with 250,000 lining the streets of the Bronx and Manhattan, whether Esther Rochel Kaminska, 80,000 people supposedly turned out to the mother of Yiddish theater when she dies and her funeral is held in Warsaw. So another big one is Jacob Gordon, the reformer of the Yiddish stage. This Russian Tolstoyan intellectual turned Yiddishist reluctantly to make a living and reach an audience in New York, and he dies in 1909. Another massive funeral. Reports, they're always varying reports, but in Gordon's case, it's 100,000 or 150,000. And of course, amongst other things, they were huge merchandising opportunities. So you have that wonderful exhibit that's up at the moment in the ground floor of the Center for Jewish History, and you have a set of memorial lapel,
Right.
what do you call them?
Right, the mourning
Pins?
pins.
Mourning pins for Yiddish actors. Extraordinary collection of these sort of black silk lapel things. And so those things would have been sold, as would, apparently cigarettes with Jacob Gordon's image on them, as soon after the event as they could rush them out, no doubt. And this is a Jewish cigarette manufacturer on the Lower East Side.
Right, Krinsky. This is a major manufacturer of cigarettes, and they, of course, I mean, I know these things from advertisements in Yiddish newspapers and magazines, and I have seen, you know, Tolstoy cigarettes. You'll see cigarettes, dedicated with photographs of or not photographs, but like, sort of engravings of famous writers. But outside of this Gordon cigarette paper, I've never seen a Jewish figure on, on a cigarette package. It's really, I think it's really unusual. Um,
Yeah, I can't recall another one either. And it's beautiful. I mean, it's a really colorful, beautiful
right, it looks like it's
thing.
gold stamped. It's
Yeah,
really, really beautifully done.
yeah.
Um,
it's not much bigger than the size of a dollar bill or $10 bill. Um, but it is, yeah, yeah. I mean, so merchandise was a big thing. You find um, uh, mirrors, sort of hand mirrors with, Molly Picon's image or
right.
Morris Schwartz's image that I assume would have been sold in the foyers of the theaters, another gorgeous sort of subset of all this stuff.
Right. Although I feel somehow that uh Yiddish, Jewish manufacturers didn't take enough advantage of exploiting, you know, actors and Jewish celebrities in general. I wish there were more of these things. I think it's really a fantastic piece. Um, so I'm curious, so this is a huge book. I mean, I haven't seen the exhibit yet, but I'm planning to come at some point. Uh, I'm curious to know what you didn't include. What wound up on the cutting room floor?
I mean, in terms of the book, more of the same. So, this was really a sort of three-way collaboration in essence with Lisa Newman, my colleague, and the publisher of the book, who Lisa runs Wyco Press here and spent huge amounts of time sort of helping shape the book and thinking about it. And the third one was our wonderful designer, Mike Grinley. And so, we endlessly discussed every spread and I don't know about you, but my instinct is always to sort of, I want more, I don't want these three things, I want 10 of them.
Right.
And their instinct was the exact opposite. And it was the right one, which is, it's going to make much more impact like the Gordon cigarette wrapper if it's just one, or if it's two, or if it's, a whole page or a double page. So, okay, all right, I'll throw out, so a lot more of the same is the answer. Um, and yeah, and in terms of the exhibition, I have a big checklist. The exhibition is and the book they're both organized thematically, not chronologically, and not as a sort of encyclopedic compendium of as many writers and figures as we could sort of think up, because there's no need to duplicate the Evo encyclopedia and other encyclopedias. So thematically was always going to be a more interesting way to organize them. And had what isn't in there is a deep focus on the shtetl or a deep focus on the world of organized Jewish labor or Hasidism or folklore. I have a long list of these subjects I would have loved to sort of devote equal time to. I mean, they're all acknowledged and represented and certainly come up in the timeline of Yiddish culture that's in the back of the book, but they don't get their own specific section. That's other things just seemed more immediately engaging and relatable and just fitted the particular mix a bit better. But yeah, had we had twice the space in the book or the exhibition, all those things would absolutely be, as the subject of your recent exhibition, Yiddish in Israel Palestine, just a fabulous, fascinating subject in its own right. It's there in the book and in the exhibition, but it doesn't get that sort of deep dive.
Right, right. I mean, it's inevitable that in something like this, you wouldn't have like you're it's so broad and there's so much and it's so rich, but the reality of this type of publication is that you can't really do that deep of a dive into any of it. But you do, you have a bibliography and people can go
Right.
further if something sparks an interest. And that's really what I love about a book like this is that it allows people it introduces uh in really in it introduces a universe to people, and they can sort of pick and choose what they want, and it's really just like sort of a fantastic entree into Yiddish culture. And even if it's something you're familiar with, there are plenty of things in this book that I had never seen before. So it's interesting to me as well, for so many different reasons. I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions for David, please put them in the Q&A section of the Zoom. And if not, we have about a little more than 10 minutes left. So we could just continue.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean it's a sort of dim sum approach, really, right?
yeah,
It's a taster, and you want to send people out intrigued and curious and wanting to find more. And the beauty of it is now, we have so many digital resources online where you can explore, so much of this stuff in more detail.
right, right. Yeah, and but it approaches it in a way that I feel like it's better than a dim sum. It's like it's a catalog, so it's kind of like a museum exhibit in your hands. And the design is beautiful, the images are beautiful, and each little section allows you to explore something different, which is really really fantastic. Um, Now, I asked what wound up on the cutting room floor. I'm curious to know if there was and you said you also added that you all want more, more, more. And there is so much more. It's really endless. But um I'm curious to know what uh the editors cut, if they did. Um and if there were any, if there was any, I'm curious to know if there was any dissent.
Oh yeah, oh, of course. I mean, two Jews and one non-Jew, but anyway, that wasn't really the issue. But certainly, three people deeply invested in a project of this sort. Yeah, we're going to argue a lot. I mean, I kind of held my ground, and sort of, I was. I mean, it's a super expensive book, so
Yeah.
this is not, an undertaking that you can do very very often, and we had a wonderful generous donor, Ria Schwartz, and her partner, who really backed this and made it possible from the beginning. But even so, you're not going to do a book of this scale that's 600 and 700 pages. I wasn't so much in my mind from the beginning, but as we got into the idea of putting the book together, I became more and more intrigued by timelines and the idea that actually there wasn't, at least to my knowledge, a good timeline, a comprehensive timeline of modern Yiddish culture. There are good timelines of Jewish history and the Holocaust and Israel and some other things, but I couldn't find one, certainly not in English, that gave an expansive panoramic view of Yiddish culture. And so I thought, well, a book like this, actually, that would be a very useful exercise
Yeah.
it's its own anthology. It's its own, way of telling the story in a really condensed form. And so I became kind of obsessed with the idea of assembling this timeline. And, it was going to be 4 pages, or actually initially it was going to be 2 pages, and then it was 4 pages, and then suddenly it was 15 pages, and, the whole economics of the book and had to be sort of rethought a bit. And, to everyone's credit, once I'd sort of completed it and shared it with my colleagues, they totally understood why it was such a sort of obsessive thing for me. So yeah, that I got my way with their support on that and not on other things. That's as it should be, really. As experts, in a way, we don't always have the best sense of, what the reader
Yeah,
um,
that's
wants to take away from a book of this sort or an exhibition. And you want people for whom it's not their 24/7
right.
obsession to say, well, actually I do find that interesting. You may know it, but I didn't, and or whatever it is. And so it's always a collaboration. You
Right.
must find this with the exhibitions that you produce.
Sure, of course. Um, yeah, that's inevitable that you can't include everything. And so I have, you know, reams of pages of, captions and texts that were taken out because it didn't fit, or there's too much text. And that, when with an exhibition, that's invariably one of the problems, is that uh you want limited text. Um, because generally, I think that people will say that people who attend museum exhibitions don't really want to spend a lot of time reading. Um, I mean, I think I find that the exhibits that I create have way too much text, because there's a story I have to tell, and the stories usually are not uninteresting. And they also provide the context for the material that I'm showing. And I think I assume you've experienced the same sort of thing. It's part of this issue with Yiddish culture is that it's not, so familiar to so many people. And as a result, you do have to provide the context um, that um, that they need. Otherwise, they really, they may come away without grasping what this is. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, the sort of straitjacket of 100 words or 150 words or 200 words for your main introductory panels, whatever it is, it's just a fantastic discipline. It's
yeah,
brutal. It's like you're writing telegrams the whole time, but at the same time, you have to tell. It's a very good way of working out, is that a story I can tell and that's worth telling in 150 words? And if it's not, then either I haven't worked out for myself what the story is, sufficiently for my understanding, or it's just too complicated to warrant, being shared in that particular format in that way. So it's just it's fascinating. Exhibitions are so intricate and so it's presenting information publicly like that is such an interesting exercise. And for the book, everything had to be rewritten because the
sure.
spatial
Yeah.
relationships are all different. It's radically selected from the exhibitions. So, and it was a sort of another opportunity to go over, have a sort of second pass at the whole thing, which was very pleasurable, and it's brutal and also pleasurable.
Right. So we do have a couple of questions from our somewhat coy audience. Um, One is from David Goldstein. He asks if the Tsena Arena in Yiddish is still being studied today in many countries.
I mean, as far as I know, it's still being read and it's still in print.
Yeah.
So, its function was so that Senorena is really, loosely known as the Women's Bible in Yiddish. It's a sort of accessible set of kind of commentaries and parables, written initially hundreds of years ago and still kind of primarily read by women. And it's very much, I mean, it's being studied by scholars, but it's very much, I believe, still current in the sort of culture as a book that's widely read. And we have a case of multiple editions of it. I think the earliest is from the early 19th century, and the second is maybe from 20 years ago or something. So
Yeah.
yes, it's as far as I know, very much still current.
Right. Yeah. The Yiddish-speaking Haredi communities in Israel and in Brooklyn and Muncie. This is still a traditionally popular book. So yes, that's still in print. Um, and then some anonymous person is asking, I have photographs of my family in Warsaw in the 1920s. I've no one to leave them to. They disappeared in the Holocaust. Who can I give them to? Um, well, I mean, I think people send all sorts of things to either the book center or to Yivo. I mean, Yivo has a huge uh, photo archive with something like 150,000 to 200,000 photographs. Um, I don't know what.
My answer would be, offer them to Yivo first and foremost, because the book center is not primarily an archive. Yivo is the preeminent archive of this whole
Yeah,
world, and obviously no guarantee that you and your colleagues will consider them of sufficient historical interest to include, but they may very well be. So
sure.
yeah,
No, but
yeah.
we have probably thousands of photographs of Warsaw of all different kinds. And this would just become part of the collection. So sure, you can send them to Evo. It would be a good place to
It's also an interesting question because there's growing interest in this field of, as it's sometimes called, vernacular photography.
yeah.
Everyday, ordinary, quote, ordinary people's photographs. Um, and there are some big archives and projects. I think there's one at Yale. Um, so who's the woman who put together the Vishniac catalog you wrote for
Oh, this is
Eddie?
Maya Benton.
Maya Benton. I think Maya
Yeah,
Benton's sort of in charge of one such project to really curate and study just everyday photographs. So there's definitely growing interest in those.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, there. Obviously, photographs are fantastic historical resource. So we're glad to have anything like that. Um, all right, unfortunately, we have to bring this to a close. Um, this was great. Thank you so much, David.
Thank
And
you so
and
much. Thoroughly, thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you.
yeah, and congratulations on a truly fantastic publications or publication. For the record, it's Yiddish, a global culture. Bold Lives, Boundless Creativity. You can buy it at the Evo online store, at the Yiddish Book Center, uh, uh, or Amazon, or any other place that carries books. Uh,
Yeah.
and
And
thank
also look for Yivo's beautiful coffee table book,
Oh, thank you.
edited by Stephanie Halperin, which
Yes.
which I love and dip into a lot and still discovering.
Right. I think that if you're interested in Yiddish culture, Yiddish and Ashkenazi, Eastern European Jewish culture, both of these books are absolutely worth owning. They're both terrific. All right, I'd like to thank everyone who joined us, and we'll see you next time at
Thank you.
our next book. Thanks so much, David.